For our next video, we are talking about the ballistic skills of kicking and punting. For kicking, the definition is simply a ballistic strike of an object with the foot. Usually, kicking requires more proficient perceptual abilities. If you think about if a ball is stationary or if it's moving, that requires the eyes to be able to track where the ball is in space, and then match that up with the movement pattern of where the foot is actually going to meet the ball or make contact. So there's eye-foot coordination that goes into kicking that we haven't really seen in our other ballistic examples or ballistic skill examples. Usually when you have kickers starting early to proficient, they progress from a stationary target to a moving target, just for ease of transition. And the book doesn't really provide any specific criterion tables or observational plans for kicking like we had for throwing, so we'll kind of keep the characteristics and developmental sequences fairly general. For characteristics of early kicking, usually we have leg action only, so this is very similar to throwing where we have arm action only. Kind of think of this as the freezing of degrees of freedom to increase stability. Since one leg does have to lift off the ground, there's a balance component. So if the body is a little bit more rigid, there's less moving parts to shift the center of mass around. Usually a preparatory step with the non-kicking leg is not taken, or it might be taken but it's very short. The kicking leg, in this image, it's this leg here, is kind of pushed forward with the knee bent at contact with the ball. And then sometimes there's also a retraction of the knee after contact, so that it might kick and then flex back into the body a little bit. But usually, also considering that kicking leg, there's not a backswing or like a preparatory backswing to get that greater velocity of the foot. Additionally, the arms and trunk remain rather motionless and rigid, again, freezing degrees of freedom to kind of increase stability. So here we have a video of a little girl kicking a ball. Okay, so if we scoot through this, we can see she takes a very short step before she kicks. But when she meets the ball, there's not really a whole lot happening between her arms and her trunk, and she has a bent knee at contact. For intermediate kicking, the image here has a kicker who has some improvements from the previous early kicker kind of cartoon figure. In this photo, we're adding a step forward, or a preparatory step, before the kick happens. The kicking leg has a preparatory backswing prior to contact with the ball. Even though this swing is kind of on the minimal side, it still helps to translate more force into the ball, so the ball could travel a greater distance. The knee is still kind of bent at contact, which is, I think that's a little bit more difficult to see in the photo. But because when the knee is bent at contact, that is going to limit or kind of truncate some of the momentum of the foot that it has from that backswing into the contact part with the ball. We also have a video, and this guy's got the zoomies, but several steps prior to the actual kick. Okay. You can still see it. It's a little bit blurred, but at contact with the ball, the knee is bent. Okay, but there is a greater degree of follow-through, larger steps going into the movement, bigger backswing. So that would be a more proficient video example than the previous video we just watched. For proficient kickers, the sequence usually includes some type of preparatory wind-up. So the trunk might rotate backwards as the support leg contacts the ground. This would be partially due to the pelvis also rotating backwards to get more range of motion in a backswing. So that's what this one is. The kicking leg is cocked backwards. And then the knee bends. So if you guys recall when we were talking about like translating force into a projectile object in our Principles of Motion lecture, that oftentimes we will bend a limb or flex a limb inwards towards the body and then extend it at the last minute before it contacts whatever the projectile object is, to maximize how much velocity we translate into that object. So those are kind of like the preparatory things. In addition, there is some forward trunk rotation as we kind of contact the ball. You can see that starting to happen here and here. There's a sequential movement of the thigh, going from internal rotation to knee extension as they make contact with the ball, and the arms start to move in opposition of the legs. So this left arm pairs with the right leg that's kicking for balance. Here's a video, and I can drag this through so we can watch slower motion. Again, multiple steps are taken before the kick takes place. Large step prior to the swing, right? And there's a huge backswing of that leg before contact with the ball. Then also here we see opposition of the arms. There's some trunk rotation throughout this movement sequence. So this person is really utilizing their mechanics to their advantage so that they can have a more forceful kick so the ball goes a further distance. As far as developmental changes in kicking, we don't really have a lot of empirical evidence on what like the developmental sequence is, which is why we don't have like one of those tables that gives us the step-by-step observations. But qualitative changes that each body part make aren't really well documented, so at best we kind of just have a general idea of what the movement pattern might look like. Current research or previous research has shown that kicking movement patterns and form may change based on distance requirements. So from a dynamical system standpoint, distance would kind of act as a control parameter, which would influence the coordinated kicking pattern that results from whatever the distance demands are. Additionally, like form changes based on distance might suggest that being able to generate a sufficient amount of force could be a key component to the development of kicking skills. So somebody might need sufficient strength depending on ball shape, size, weight, where it's located, if it's, falling down from the sky, if it's moving, or if it's stationary. Other research has shown that about 10% of 7 to 9-year-olds display advanced kicking form. That's a pretty low percentage for an age group that should be where what we consider probably should be fairly proficient in kicking, or at least have enough muscular strength and balance to perform a proficient kick. So similar to throwing, kicking is likely a skill that requires more practice and experience to gain higher proficiency levels rather than it just kind of naturally developing and occurring. Our next ballistic skill in this set is punting. So punting is a form of kicking where an object, in our case a ball, is dropped from the hands before impact with the foot. So this, mechanically speaking, punting is very similar to kicking, but it involves a lot more difficulty due to the temporal demands, or like timing between the drop and the kick. tracking and aiming at a moving object, and then the requirement for coordination and balance. Since, again, they do have to stand on one leg at one point or another during the movement sequence. For characteristics of early punting, usually we notice that the ball is tossed up rather than just being dropped from midair. Usually the release of the ball occurs after the support leg is on the ground, if a step is taken at all. Also, there's usually rigid extension of the knee, or the knee is bent at a right angle at the point of contact with the ball. The foot or ankle is also typically at a right angle, so a lot of ankle dorsiflexion. And then there's more emphasis of kicking with the toes rather than the instep in an early punt. You can also see here there's a lack of use of the arms. They kind of just drop to the side, so they're not really being utilized for balance or to counterbalance different rotational movements that could occur in the trunk or the pelvis as the leg is swinging through for the kick. In proficient punting, usually we see that the arms extend to drop before the final stride, or arms extend to drop the ball before the final stride, so we kind of lift the ball up, extend the arms out, and then from here to here, that means the ball has dropped. Arms fall to the side and begin to move in opposition of the legs, so we kind of see this oppositional movement here in the arms in the last figure, or last picture in that figure. Usually there's a leap step, okay, so again increasing the distance across which a force is applied by lengthening that step, which then can translate to greater velocity of the foot because it's traveling a greater arc length. But that leap would result in a more forceful swing of the kicking leg, thus a more forceful kick. Ball travels farther distance. Lastly, in proficient punting, usually we notice knee extension and ankle plantar flexion at the point of contact. So less kicking with the tips of the toes, more kicking with either the top of the foot or the instep. As far as developmental changes in punting, we can break down our sequence by looking at the arm action, at ball release, and ball contact. And then we can look at the leg action at ball contact. Typically, punts are best observed from a side view in order to determine what developmental stage a person might be at. So, when we look at arm action in the ball release phase, we've got our sequence progressing from step 1 to 4. Over to the right, we also have a figure that outlines the observational plan for determining what level in the sequence a person might be at. So the first question we ask ourselves is, does the player toss the ball up as a part of their release? If we say yes, the person would be at step 1 with an upward toss classification. So usually in a step 1, the hands are on the sides of the ball. It's tossed upward either after the support foot has landed, or if there's no step, it's just a toss-up. If there is no toss-up of the ball, and it actually is dropped as it should be, then we have to ask if the ball is dropped before or after the final step onto the support leg. If it's as the person steps or after the person steps, we refer to that step 2 and 3 would be considered late drops. So if we have a drop from chest height, that if it's considered a step back from if we had dropped from the waist, because it's dropping late from the chest, there's further distance for the ball to fall. So thus timing between the kicking leg and the release part might be more messed up than if a person had dropped the ball late from more of their waist level. What we really want, so that's steps 2 and 3, what we really want is an early drop from chest height, so dropping the ball from a chest height before you make the last step onto the support leg. So if we want to watch this like early punter example, I would probably argue she'd be considered under step 2. So if we kind of draw ourselves through this, her hands are on both sides of the ball. Okay, it's at, I would say, probably relatively chest height, but she kind of drops it, right? She doesn't really toss it upwards, but rather it dropped from that height. That's why I would say she probably is a late drop from chest height with regards to the arm action at the ball release phase. We also have a proficient punting example. Okay, so in this one, I think it's pretty easy to determine that he's a step 4. Okay, so his arms draw upwards and forwards. We have a release of the ball at chest height before that final support step, which is that heel strike there. Okay, that would be an example of a step 4. We then can also look at arm action at the point of contact with the ball. So the first question we ask ourselves is, do the arms drop to the sides after ball release? If the answer is yes, we say that's step 1 of our developmental sequence, in which the arms are just dropping bilaterally from ball release to a position on each side of the hips as the foot comes in contact with the ball. For step 2, instead of dropping more down through the sagittal plane, we might observe that the arms go out to the side, or we have more abduction of the arms. They don't necessarily have to be straight arms, they could be bent, a variation of the two. But generally speaking, if the arms bilaterally abduct after the ball release, then we say a person is in step 2 of their developmental sequence. As for step 3, which is kind of our highest level of proficiency, we would notice that after the ball releases, the arms bilaterally abduct during flight, so you let it go, right? And then the opposite arm of the kicking leg swings forward, while the other arm would abduct to the side and kind of be a little bit more placed behind the body. So if we revisit our early punter example, I would say she probably falls under step 2. So if we go through this a little bit slower, after she releases the ball at the point of contact, we see her arms are abducted to the side. For our proficient punter, if we drag through the video, after he releases, we have abduction of the arms. His kicking leg is his right leg. So in this frame we can see the left arm moves in opposition to the kicking leg, and then the right arm stays abducted and kind of more behind his body. The last thing we look at in a punt is the leg action. So this is specifically at the ball contact phase, and also slightly before the contact. I think it's easier to associate it with contact though. So a person may take no step or might have a short step, at which we would say they're at step 1 in the developmental sequence. And usually they display more ankle dorsiflexion than plantar flexion. Step 2, they might take a longer step and have more ankle plantar flexion at the point of contact. So starting to utilize more of our principles of motion to get more force translated into the kicking part of the punt. And then step 3, our most proficient level, there would be a leap and a hop. So a leap going into or onto the support limb, and then a hop after the kicking motion has been completed. So in our proficient punting example, I would say she's definitely step 1, because if you look at her feet, she doesn't take a step before the kick actually happens. Okay, so that one's pretty easy to identify. And then for this example, for our proficient kicker, he's definitely at a step 3. So we can see from his run, there's a leap onto that left foot, and then a hop after the ball contact. Okay, so that's the developmental sequence for kicking and punting. In our next video, we will go through different forms of striking.